Hello everyone, this is Nathan Manning here with GoAppDeveloper.com, and today we have a very special guest, Ryan Morel, who's going to help us to learn all about how to advertise your app. Both Ryan and I have been in the mobile industry for over a decade, and I think it's safe to say that over that time a lot of things have changed, and even just a few years ago it was significantly easier as an app developer to create a great product, to do some basic PR and launch it and hope for the best. And over the last couple of years, the ecosystem has really changed. It's become more important to have a network, whether it's your own network or whether it's working with other developers to promote your app, and also the importance of and power of marketing, both informally through community management and also through CPC and CPI. Advertising has also become more important. So Ryan has been around the mobile industry for a long time. He's been on the developer side, also worked as a publisher, and most recently he works for a company called PlacePlay, which is a mobile advertising company that focuses on locally targeted mobile advertising. We're very lucky to have Ryan with us today, and Ryan is going to help us to understand the importance of mobile advertising in general for developers and some of the techniques that developers can use to make their applications more successful through mobile advertising. So Ryan, thanks again for joining us and welcome to the today's discussion. Why don't we start out by you giving our audience an overview of why it is that mobile advertising is important for app developers?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Mobile advertising is important for lots of different reasons, and it really depends on what your ultimate goals are, right? So it can be used really for a couple different things. One is to generate cash and or revenue, either as your primary or secondary source. Another is to be able to generate downloads of your app. As it relates to being able to generate downloads, one of the really big benefits of mobile advertising is to be able to generate spikes in downloads. So, we see a lot of developers, especially those that are relatively new, kind of just run ongoing small mobile advertising campaigns. And while those are good for driving incremental downloads over time, they ultimately don't move the needle, right? So every app developer's goal should be to get as many downloads as possible in the shortest time frame as possible, so that they can move into the top 25 of their respective chart, whether that's even just in a category level or overall game level or app level.
I know that there have been some statistics lately on exactly what it takes to get into the top 25 in a category, but if you're an app developer, I guess a couple questions. First of all, how much exactly does it take to get into the top 25, let's say in the US, in the games category? And secondly, I know that a lot of developers spend time thinking about which categories to put their apps into. Is it better to go for a category where you can get into the top 25 and you kind of get that exposure, or do you think it's better to go for categories that are more popular?
I've heard arguments for both. The challenge with going for really popular categories like action, arcade, /puzzle is they're super competitive. And they're competitive not only because there's fantastic content in there, but those guys also happen to have a lot of money. So if you want to compete in there, you need to have a really good title, and you need to be able to spend accordingly to beat those guys. Unless you happen to get lucky and your game is a viral hit, and counting on that is not a great strategy. So we have seen, and the guys over at Distinct Dev and who did the Morel test would claim that they were the ones who invented putting a game in the entertainment category. Mm-hmm. And that worked out phenomenally well for them, right? So the Morel test was in the top 50 overall paid games, I think, for almost 3 years. So it can work well. The challenge that I think exists with that strategy is you might be limiting the number of people who can actually see it. So, for example, let's take productivity, right? So the reality is there are very, very few productivity apps that crack the top 100 and get a substantial amount of organic eyeballs in the overall ranking charts, right? it's just pretty unlikely. So, I mean, we have seen examples of it, right? Clear did really well when it launched. But you can probably count them on, one or two hands how many times that has happened. So in terms of overall numbers, you hear various stories from anywhere from 35 to 75,000 downloads a day to get into the top 25 game category. That's what I read that recently. I think that's probably low. I know a couple years ago when I was part of a publishing company and we had the number one game and free, we were generating hundreds of thousands of downloads a day. And that was a couple years ago when the market was a third the size it is now. So if I was an app developer, because all these numbers and statistics get thrown around like candy, I'd be trying to extrapolate where I could get in the rankings based on the download numbers that I have today using an exponential curve, right? So it's certainly not linear, right? One download doesn't equal spot 10, two doesn't equal 9, et cetera, et cetera.
I think it's super important to try and get into the top 25 in a category, but past that point, there's also, to a certain extent, there's a diminishing return with mobile advertising because, to go from the, 26th spot to the 25th may require an additional, 2,000 downloads, right? But to go from the, 5th to the 4th may require an additional, 10,000 downloads or something, depending on the category that you're in. So I think the goal is to generate enough of a spike to get you to the point that you're getting exposure, hopefully in at least the games category or kind of the main category that your application is in, and certainly in the top 25 for the subcategory like arcade or action. But beyond that point, you need to be careful because the truth is that if your game is good and it gets to the point where it's getting exposure, your hope is that then people will try it and it kind of takes on a life of its own and starts to generate organic downloads. Yeah. So the goal is to figure out exactly how much you need to get into that top 25, and then I would say, if all goes well, to gradually decrease the amount of spend that you're putting in as the organic downloads kick in. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to note here that the people that we see doing this well have really high grossing games that don't exist in the free charts, right? So Dragon Veil is a really good example that has been in the top 10 grossing for a year and a half or something like that. I can't remember the last time I saw it in the top free charts, right? So they were able to really understand what their user's life cycle looks like, what the lifetime value looks like of that user, and then spend accordingly to get them. So I would say that not only is it important to get into the top 25 to give yourself a chance, it's important essentially not to blow your to blow your wad on the first go, right? I would certainly not recommend trying to generate a spike right out of the gate without really understanding how your users are going to behave and how much money you're going to make from them. There's too many examples of people spending $50,000 and their monetization screwed up and they don't make any money.
It's not entirely clear how much truth there is to this, but I think certainly the perception among certain publishers is that there are bonuses that are applied to your downloads in the period when you go live, right? At least that's what it feels like. It feels like it's easier when you first launch an application to get it into the top 25 than it is after it's been live for a while. And it's some of that could be that it's more likely to go into what's new category or what's hot and whatever at the beginning, and that could be a boost. But I've also heard people talking about the perspective that there are probably algorithm bonuses that are applied when an application goes live, just because that would be the only way for Apple, for example, to make sure that new content gets any kind of exposure. Otherwise, you'd always be competing with people that, by definition, are getting large amounts of organic traffic, and you'd never break in, right? So,
sure.
I think certainly one way or another, you need to make sure that you test before you start your advertising campaign, and that probably leads to the next question around. What are some of the things that developers can do to make sure that when they invest money in that spike campaign that it actually does well, right? I mean, is it a matter of A/B testing? I know some developers have even moved to the more extreme end of launching in only a couple of countries first, or one country first, and testing and then rolling out globally. What advice would you give developers in terms of making sure that the ad campaigns are effective on day one?
Yeah, so I think let's cover a couple different things. So I'm sure that you get more credit for getting downloads early on, because of course they base some of that ranking on historical downloads, and if your historical downloads don't exist, right, it's going to be higher. First, and I think we can kind of just put this to bed, is that you should figure out, you're right, you should figure out a way to test. Canada seems to be the most appropriate place to do that. Also have heard some people starting to launch on Android first, because then you get a much wider testing range, and you're probably not going to make a ton of money on Android anyway, so get it out there and figure out what works. Not necessarily apples to apples, but probably pretty close. So in terms of optimizing your mobile advertising, I'd be looking at, again, at the round of testing. What are the various different services you can use? So that includes simple things like pay-per-click advertising, cost per install advertising, incentivized install advertising, or mostly those are like CPA networks. Things like free app a day, app gratis, et cetera, that will promote you to their hundreds of thousands, if not millions of consumers in a short period of time to drive downloads. I would recommend that developers have a really strong understanding of which of those channels drives the most appropriate traffic for their content, and then continuously double down on those. So, for example, if you launch your app in Canada first or on Android, I would run small tests of maybe $250 to $500 per channel for things like AdMob, Jump Tap, etc., for banner ads and other apps, and see how those perform. So not only how many installs do you get from them, but what does the user behavior look like from those channels? And you can use things like mobile app tracking, et cetera, to identify what the lifetime value of those customers are. I would use incentivized install services. It doesn't work on iOS, but it does work on Android. And again, you'll probably find that you can drive a really high amount of traffic, but the users might not be as valuable. And ultimately, you kind of know what's going to happen with free app a day or app gratis, assuming you have the cash and good enough content to get accepted by them. I mean, they're going to drive you a substantial number of users. So I think, simply put, it's test the different channels before making a big spend. Identify what works best, not only from a conversion perspective, but also a customer lifetime value perspective, and then double down there.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of thoughts here. One is that I'm a big believer in using your customers to decide what your marketing should look like in the first place. So I think the developers that are more in touch with the reviews that their games are getting in app stores, the ones that have better relationships with their customers in social media, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and that actively use those channels to get feedback, are going to be in a much better position to put their advertising in the words of their consumers, and that's going to be more effective. And the other thing I would say is, one of the first things I would do, especially if I was a developer that was a little bit new to mobile advertising, is to really start to pay attention to the kinds of advertising that the big publishers are doing. The reality is that there's a lot of kind of wisdom already out there in the market, and while you shouldn't copy people directly, you can always look at, what are the formats that people are using, how many words are they putting on their banners, what kinds of colors are they using, and if you take the 80% that you think is probably working and then innovate on top of that, then you'll save yourself a lot of work in trying to create something from scratch. And then, of course, from there, once you've got a good understanding of what's working in the market and you've really thought about what kinds of messages do you want to put into your advertising based on what your customers are saying, then you can do exactly what you're saying and make sure that you test either with test campaigns on certain CPC, CPI channels, or in a specific geography if you want to go to the step of launching, saying, in Canada first. And it's probably pretty obvious, but the reason that you would do a country like Canada is that it's it's similar enough culturally to the US, where most people want to or think they can make the most of their money, but it's not it's not going to be in the top. I don't think it's in the top 5 in terms of iOS sales. So I think you raised an interesting point there about the types of advertising networks, and I know that there's a lot of there are a lot of buzzwords that are thrown around, and it can be quite a complicated thing to get your head around as an independent developer. So I think it would be really useful first if you could give us an understanding of what are the different types of mobile advertising networks, and secondly, maybe you and I can talk a little bit about the strategy that you might apply if you have a different game. So, for example, it's going to make the most sense to use an ongoing, sustaining CPI campaign when you have a freemium app and you know that the average revenue per customer for that app is going to, over the lifetime of that customer playing the game, is going to pay for whatever it costs you to get that download. But with a premium app, with a paid app, that's potentially not going to be the right strategy. You might want to focus more on lifecycle management, and if you do any advertising, then maybe do a spike at the beginning. So first of all, what are those different categories of advertising?
Yeah. So the simplest one is performance networks. The most common is CPC advertising, and this can be for a variety of different ad formats. Banner advertising, video, as well as interstitials. And this would also include like CPI advertising or cost per install stuff, right? So those are the people that are going to charge you for every time someone clicks on your advertisement or every time someone takes an action based on that. In the case of most app developers, this is going to be around downloading your app, right? The really nice thing about performance networks is the CPCs can be extremely low. So right now, minimum bids on AdMob for CPC advertising are a penny, which is fantastic for the people buying those clicks and horrible for the people giving them up. The challenge with that you typically have with banner advertising, especially to drive app downloads, is the conversion rates are just really low. So one of the reasons they're so cheap is just because you're going to have to get a lot of clicks to get a single download, right? Then there.
I would just jump in there. I mean, based on my experience, I've certainly seen that AdMob can work, but it's not as much of a deal as it sounds like, right? I mean, by the time you get to the conversion, I mean, you're probably looking at 60 cents to $1 on the very, very low end for a download of a free app anyway. Yeah. And you can get that at least more towards the dollar range with a lot of services like Tapjoy or JumpTap or some of the other performance networks.
Yep. And we've seen, just from our own numbers, I mean, 60 to 100 clicks to a conversion would be really good. So, we've seen anywhere from like 100 to 400 on average, which speaks to a couple different things. So one, there's clearly a lot of accidental clicks, and that's a problem. And two, developers need to spend a really good amount of time connecting the advertising they're showing to the rest of their marketing, i.e. App Store, description, screenshots, etc. Because people, let's pretend 70% of those clicks are real. That means that 70% were interested enough to click on your ad, but your App Store description, your screenshots, etc. weren't good enough to make them take the next step. So that doesn't mean your advertising or AdMob's not working. That means you've failed somewhere else, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind here.
I'll say one thing that is good for a network like AdMob, and that is that the advantages of one of the advantages of a self-serve network is that it's super easy to do A/B testing, and so sometimes even if you're going to use other performance networks, especially the ones that maybe have a more targeted gaming audience, where the conversion is going to be higher, but the cost per click or the CPI will be higher. It's often good to start with a network like AdMob Anywhere, where you can test multiple creatives, multiple messages, multiple geographies, and then roll out those learnings to the other performance networks.
Yep, exactly. And you can make those tests really quickly, and like you said, really cheaply. So let's move on to the interstitials and kind of CPI model. The good thing there is you pay on it's a flat fee. So instead of paying per click, you're paying per actual install. And these numbers are they're high, right? Because you've got a lot of people like Gree, a lot of people like DNA, EA, et cetera, who are paying substantial amounts of money to acquire new users, to essentially buy the market. Fortunately for the rest of us, the market's so big and there's so many people within it, hard for them to do that. But to really be competitive and to get the best users, you're going to be paying anywhere from to $4 at this point. Especially now that we're getting into the holidays, things are just really, really expensive, right? So that's kind of these performance networks. You can do CPC advertising through people like AdMob and Mobi, JumpTap, et cetera. You can do pay-per-install advertising through the same groups of people, but that also opens you up to a variety of others, including my company, Chartboost, Burstly, et cetera. That's one type of network. Then we have kind of the incentivized, let's call it CPA networks. They're not just downloads anymore, like Tapjoy, Flurry, W3I, et cetera, who are essentially they're offer wall businesses, where users can download an app, like somebody on Facebook, sign up for Netflix, sign up for Hulu in exchange for some amount of coins and or currency. Back in the day on iOS, this was available. It's not anymore, so you're kind of out of luck. There's consistently new services popping up to try to get around Apple's ban of this, but none of them seem to have taken hold yet. On Android, it does exist. The challenge that we continue to see is only a certain percentage of these users turn into actual users, right? If you look at the behavior, it tends to be some percentage of those people download the app, get their free download the app, open it, get their free coins, close it, and never use it again. Which might be okay for some people, right? If you're trying to acquire a lot of downloads really quickly, in order to propel you into a ranking that will enable organic downloads to take over, then that's okay. But if you're using incentivized installs to really drive actual paying customers, it may or may not work. I think some people have had good success, some people have not. So you have to test it.
I guess a question that a lot of people might have is there's been a lot of noise recently about Apple banning apps that have these incentivized offer walls and such in them. But as a developer, do you even have the option? Can you still go to one of these incentivized networks and do advertising, or has Apple pretty much shut everything down? What is the state for people that want to advertise, not necessarily to publish?
If you want to advertise for your app to be downloaded?
Yeah, like from what I understand, Apple's basically been cracking down on these types of services, and in many cases rejecting new apps, and in some cases even banning apps that have been live in the store for a long time. But the actual networks are still live, right? So I mean, if you're an advertiser, you can still advertise in the app that already have these services included in them, right?
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, I think the opportunity is still there, and it will always exist in some form or another because people continue to just figure out ways around it. But the volume isn't quite what it used to be, as far as I understand. So that means that, well, a couple things. If you're an advertiser, you're going to have to pay more, just because of the supply and demand. There's tons of people want to acquire users. That hasn't gone away, but the access to them has decreased, so therefore cost goes up. The piece here is that you just can't get as many of them, right? Those are very related things, obviously, but hard to say that you're going to be able to generate the requisite number of downloads in a short period of time in order to get into the top 25 of your category. I mean, I don't know that to be true, but that's just based on my guess and understanding of basic economics.
Yeah, and I think this actually raises another interesting point, which is that there's pretty much no single network that you can go to if your goal is to generate a spike and get yourself into the top 25 in your category. That's going to be able to do it all for you, right? So no matter what you do, if you're serious about using advertising to pump your app up, you're going to have to use a combination of ad networks and or a network kind of aggregator to give you access to customers across multiple networks anyway, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's kind of, so the next type of networks are these, really concentrated promotional networks. And maybe calling them an ad network isn't appropriate, but people like Free App a Day that have this huge following of people that can blast you out to their big number of, the vast number of users. There's another Free App a Day service popping up they're not quite as popular as they once were, because Free App a Day and App Gratis kind of won the market, but they're still everywhere, right? And can help you drive a large number of traffic in a really small period of time. I think that the challenge here is, are these really the type of people that you want? They may or may not be. They're probably not, because by opting into a service like Free App a Day, someone has self-selected themselves as someone who isn't that interested in paying money in the first case, and second, they want a new app every day, right? Or is highly likely to want a new app every day. So that means their attention span and is distributed across a high number of apps and or content.
I would just jump in there and say that I think there are actually two potential scenarios where these types of services are really useful. The first is that I haven't seen any other services that can generate the kind of spike that Free App a Day or App Gratis can in their respective geographies for the amount of money that you spend. So, I mean, it's not unusual to generate, several 100,000 downloads of your free app over a several-day period, which in many cases is enough to push you up into the top 25. And once you're there, I think you're correct that the people that are a part of the network are perhaps not the best customers in terms of lifetime value. But if you can get into the top 25 and you have a good app, then that can often be enough to generate traffic and real customers that then monetize better. Mm-hmm. And the second time that these types of networks can be very useful is when you have a game that has been premium for a while and for whatever reason you've reached the point in the game's life cycle that you're ready to move it to a freemium game. These can be a great transition tool to help facilitate that, right? I mean, if you've got an app that you're going to make free or freemium anyway, you may as well use one of these services to give it that initial boost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. When I was doing publishing, we would acquire a bunch of users via a variety of sources, and we would see our usage pattern stay flat, right? Despite having an extra 50,000 downloads or something, you go, okay, well, those are some great downloads at best. Would see where we did things like Free App a Day, and we would have a huge spike in usage, and then it would drop right back down, right? So, everyone just needs to be aware of what they're getting into, and ultimately, I think, and Nate, you and I have talked about this before, there's no silver bullet here, right? So, because if there was, everyone would do it. This stuff, it takes a lot of work, it takes constant testing, it takes constant measurement, and it takes constant optimization to extend the life of your app beyond just that initial spike, right? And it's not something that is simple by any stretch of the imagination.
So I guess the final category of advertising networks would be promotional networks where developers make deals between themselves. Do you have any good examples of that?
Yeah. So, Chartboost is the most the most common one that people use. There are people like Bursley who also do a good job. They tend to be focused on higher end posts, however. Companies like Tap for Tap also do some essentially link exchange. PlacePlay does essentially link exchange between apps. We do it automatically, so you don't have to go set up relationships with additional developers. But these are any type of service like this where you can get free awareness and free downloads is something that you should absolutely go do. If you don't have a large network of developer friends, then use something like Tap for Tap or PlacePlay. If you do have a large number of developers and you're a well-known brand, using something like Chartboost and or Bursley makes a lot of sense because you can go do those deals directly. It kind of just depends on where you are in your studio lifecycle and how well-known your content is. But anything that you can do to promote your own content outside of your existing network is worth doing.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think I think what's difficult now is that there is, like you said, there is no simple silver bullet or one approach that's going to work for everybody. And I think the reality is that most developers now, if they take the time to put together a well thought out marketing campaign, are going to end up using a combination of most of these types of services. I think it's certainly, you have more options if you have a free or a freemium game than if you have a paid game, for example. There's plenty out there if you take the time to look for it. So what advice would you give to people that have different categories of games? So for example, if I have a paid application, what kinds of advertising techniques will potentially work best for me?
Paid apps are always harder, right? Just because there is, despite the fact that it might only be 99 cents in today's world, that's apparently a lot, despite the fact that people will spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on an interest. So if I was doing a paid app, I would focus probably a lot less on simple CPC networks like AdMob, et cetera, because the number of you're going to need to get is just really high. And I might look at more of the incentivized install services. The reality is you're going to need to spend substantially more to get someone to pay for a 99-cent game. So call it $3 or $4 or maybe even $5 for a single download. But it's a little bit more likely that they'll actually play it because they did pay for it. They got a bunch of return, but they still paid for it. I would focus probably more heavily on kind of frankly, this is outside of mobile advertising, but more on earned media and awareness advertising if I was doing a paid app at this point. I know you and I, Nate, have talked a lot about community marketing and how to engage them. Those are probably the right avenues for paid apps and not your kind of standard advertising. You're just going to have to spend too much money to generate that spike. Unless, however, you give it away for free. At that point, giving it, we've seen this time and time again. You give away, you turn it back to paid. It generates some amount of additional revenue. Hard to know if that strategy is really at this point. But there was a period of time when it really was.
Yeah, and I think there's two other things. I think first of all, there aren't many cases that I can think of where it wouldn't be a good idea to have a free version of your game, even if nothing else, it gives you the flexibility to have multiple advertising options and to build a large customer base that you can then upsell later, or to build a community around. A free app is in some ways easier because you can ask people to do more in terms of connecting with you through your social media networks because they're getting the game for free. You can be a little bit more aggressive with your advertising, and then you can upsell those customers to your paid app later. So I think that paid apps are tough, like you said, and I probably wouldn't ever be in a situation where I wouldn't have a free version of the game to advertise as well. I don't know of too many advertising networks that will even allow you to advertise a paid game through their network, and the ones that do usually can't give you the kind of volume that you need to push you up into the ranks. So I think you're looking at either having a free game and or doing lifecycle management and hoping that you have enough value in the game that that you can make it work. The other thing I would say on this is that you're going to have a pretty tough time as a developer these days not having a network, and you're going to need to either find a publisher, do direct deals with other developers, or build your own network. And so if you have a game that has a popular character or brand but it hasn't become a commercial success, I would say that one of the strategies you could use would be to continue to make brand extensions and build out your brand and then cross-sell your own products and be successful that way. Yeah. But I think you're right. I think it is tough as a developer with a paid app if that's all you have. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I never thought I would get point, but if I were developing apps today, I would stay away from paid apps, 100%. And there's a couple different reasons for that. So one, it's extremely hard to drive that initial spike. So acquiring users is just more difficult. And two, the paid app categories are essentially owned at this point, right? So they're not as liquid as you see in the free categories, because people like Rovo, people like EA, people like Gameloft, Doodle Jump, Moron Test, Zeptolab with Cut the Rope, right? Those guys own certain spots in the top 100, and there's so much built up awareness, not only of their characters and their apps, but of those brands. It's just really hard to unseat them from those spots. You can maybe generate a spike where you get it put into the top 10 for a couple days and you make $100,000, but then you're never heard from again. Maybe. I just think it's really hard. If you are EA or someone of their level, sure, go do it, because you have this IP and awareness that you can take advantage of. If you're a small developer, you can certainly get lucky, and we've seen it time and time again. But I think you're right. You have to have a publisher, or you have to have something that is 10 times better than everything else to get people to be aware of it, download it, and use it. And with free, it's just so easy to drive user. It's not so easy. It's much easier to drive users and awareness in a free app than it is a paid one.
No, I totally agree. I mean, even if you look at, as we're doing this call, Pudding Monster just released yesterday by Zeptolabs, and I mean, if you look at the amount of kind of built up ecosystem that Cut the Rope has, it's millions and millions of install base. It's hundreds of thousands of people on their Facebook page, and even with all of the power that they have to push any app that they release, Pudding Monsters was only number 8 in the US as of today after a day. And who knows, maybe it'll go higher. But the point is that even with all of the power that they have, they still have to fight to get into the top 10. Yeah, and I mean, personally, I'm a little bit biased towards the perspective, no matter what business you're in, whether it's games or platform or whether you own a restaurant. First, focus on building a community and building a large base of customers, and then find a way to monetize them, rather than going out with something that you're hoping people will pay for, but no one's actually using it yet.
I think it's really important, and we're kind of getting a little bit off topic here, but I think it's really important for developers to understand their ability, not only their ability to develop good content, but understand their ability to make a meaningful impact in the market. It's okay to develop an app and not get into the top 25. That doesn't mean you failed. You can still make money. You just have to do things a little bit differently. And I think the important piece here is setting your expectations correctly, so that when you do build an app and you do go out to generate a spike, you know what that spike's going to get you, and whether or not that's going to be enough to sustain your business and build your next app, right? Because that's the goal, is make enough money so that you can afford to build your next app and maybe buy dinner or something like that. We see a lot of really good content not go anywhere because somewhere along the line someone missed the puzzle, right? And there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and if you miss one, it doesn't work. And one of those pieces is really understanding what sandbox you can play in that you can win. Because sandbox filled with Rovio, Zeptolab, Zynga, there's a lot of big kids in that sandbox.
So let's bring this back to mobile advertising a bit. I think this is probably the last main topic that we have time for. Specifically, if you were starting out as a mobile app developer again today, and you were trying to put together your first mobile advertising campaign for a game, what would be the steps that you would go through in order to give yourself the greatest chance of being successful? Yeah,
so I think we've kind of talked about all of them, I think, in over the course of this conversation. So let's try to piece them all together. So I think you made a really good point about using your consumers and what they're saying about you to start identifying what the correct messaging is. So what do people say about in reviews? What do they say about on your Facebook page? What are the things that they're sharing with their friends? So those are really good places to start to identify what the messaging is for your advertising campaigns. And the second piece is start to test those messages, not only the text and or images, but where you display them, so that you can understand, what message with what text with what creative works best, across various channels, not only to drive installs, but also to drive actual users, and which channels provide the highest value users. And this stuff doesn't happen in days, right? It takes weeks of understanding what the best way to do this stuff, so that you can get to a point of, hey, now I'm ready to drive a spike, and I'm going to drive, let's pretend that you've identified that your organic channels drive you the most high value users. Okay, well, that's obvious. And to get to a high number of organic users, you need to do, X on AdMob, Y on Chartboot, Z on PlacePlay, and you need to top it off with the free app a day campaign. And if you've done all of your background work beforehand, you should have a pretty clear idea of how many users you're going to be able to drive in what period, as well as how much money you're going to be able to make from them. So now you know what your budget is. You essentially want to do all the work beforehand to really understand how much I'm going to have to spend to get the amount of users I need to be profitable on this. And you do that through testing.
In some ways, a lot of developers tend to be a little bit intimidated by the creative side of marketing, but testing is one of the areas where most of the developers that I know could actually do very well, because they tend to have a very analytical approach to things. And if you dissect the process into pieces, it can actually be kind of fun to break down the different pieces and see which creative is working best and which targeting is working best. And the reality is that most people think about marketing as being this big creative approach, and there's certainly a creative aspect to it. But the thing that really separates successful marketing from marketing that completely fails is how much testing and how much rigor goes into the process of seeing what works.
Fortunately or unfortunately, it's not rocket science. It just takes work and it takes time, and you just got to do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you mentioned before as well that it's really important for developers to be realistic as they're looking at what they want to accomplish with their game. And I think in some ways it's better to understand the actual numbers of downloads that it takes to succeed in the markets that you're going after. And if you don't have the financial resources to break into that category in the US, for example, it's almost better to admit that up front and either find a publisher or take a different approach with the type of game that you develop, or with take a slower approach, right? Build something that has a very strong niche community, and then keep your costs low and build that community over time. Release other versions of the game, other applications that target the same users, and start to build your own network. Than it is to build a game, think that this is either going to make me super rich or it's going to fail, and I need to put $50,000 into CPA and see if I can push it into the top 25 in the US. It's a pretty risky approach, and unless you have something that is truly magical, it's something that may end up biting you in the ass, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there's all types of success, especially in the App Store. And though, you hear a lot about the people who make a lot of money, and you hear a lot about the vast number of people that make no money, the reality is there are people that live in between. And those people have done a really good job of building their community and their app over time, and generating maybe not huge spikes, but some spikes along the way to keep them relevant in the top. So, I mean, a good example here is I keep seeing Unblock Me everywhere. That game's been around forever, and he kind of just keeps it going, right? Doodle Jump is another example where, he's not in the top 25 anymore, but he's hanging top 50, and he's been there for 3 years, right? And that's just, I mean, admittedly, he has some additional advantages, and but it's work. You don't get to be in the top 50 and stay there by just screwing around, right?
No, I totally agree. Probably I would close this by saying that the most important things for app developers to remember are that, number one, marketing is an important topic, and it needs to be a conscious choice what you decide to do. Mm-hmm. So as you're planning the timeline for your release, make sure that you build in enough time to support whatever marketing it is that you want to do. Secondly, be realistic and don't be afraid to reach out and get help if you need it, right? Mm-hmm. That help can take many forms. It can be informally by finding a buddy that happens to do marketing. It can be connecting with an agency. It can be finding a publisher if you're an independent developer. But don't feel like you need to do it all by yourself. However, if you do want to do it by yourself, then make sure that you use a diverse approach, understand the goals that you have and the number of downloads that you need to receive, and also the type of game that you have and the kinds of advertising that will be most appropriate for your game in the time frame that you have, and plan it out and make it a conscious decision. So that's about it. Ryan, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just echo that, especially from a mobile advertising perspective. There is some psychological, innate or psychology buff you could add to this, where people start spending money and seeing clicks and they want to do more, right? This is how Google has built a massive business. Because if people are clicking on it, it must be working. And that's not always the case. So, I would say that, mobile advertising can be highly effective, and testing and making adjustments, testing, optimizing over and over and over and over is really the only way to make it work. And it also doesn't work for everybody, and people should need to be aware of that. You can do all of the right things and find out it doesn't work. That can be a challenge, but you need to be able to recognize when it's clear that it doesn't work and move on to something else.
I would say it's much better to be the smart developer with a long-term perspective, build lots of games, learn from every single one of them, build communities, have great relationships with your customers, and eventually over time, every single game will move you one step closer to that hit. Yep. And it's probably not going to be the game that you throw a bunch of money behind. It'll be the one that is the culmination of all of the kind of wisdom that you've gained by releasing a lot of different things and building great relationships and a good reputation.
Yep, exactly.
So I think that's about all the time we have today, Ryan, and thanks again for taking the time to be with us and share your wisdom on how app developers can be more successful with their mobile advertising. If anyone has questions for you, they can reach you via your website at placeplay.com. And I know that you guys have been doing a lot of great work on making an advertising network that monetizes better than almost anything out there. So I really encourage people to take a look and get in touch if they're interested. From my side, I'm working on goappdeveloper.com, and my goal is to help developers to make more money. So you can always visit me there, and if you have any questions, then you can reach me at nathan@goappdeveloper.com or on Twitter at Nathan Manning. So thanks again for taking the time to be with us, and look forward to talking with you on a future interview.
Great. Thank you.